Hello, this is my case study for EDL 850, and my name is Jack Sampel. So, what we have first is the St. Regis School, and it holds grades K through 8. The teachers purchased new computer software programs with their allocated funds through PTA fundraising. The PTA was able to purchase a computer lab containing 20 computers, and this is where the software programs were going to be used. The library media specialist, in an attempt to help other teachers utilize the new software in their individual classrooms, decided to make copies of the program. She did not receive permission from the author of the software program or Mr. Sampel. The copies were distributed to Mrs. Williams and Mrs. Brandon, the school's third grade teachers. Now, Mrs. Brandon, she is new to the school district. She said that she was very aware that this might be violating copyright laws. She told Mr. Sampel, the school's principal, about this concern, and Mr. Sampel spoke with Mrs. Lynn, the library media specialist, about the copyright concerns. Mrs. Lynn says she's just trying to save the school money. Nobody will know or care about the little small town school of St. Regis, having a few extra program copies. Lastly, Mrs. Evans, the PTA president, said she was happy that they were stretching PTA dollars. So the legal issues with this are obvious copyright infringement laws, and really this is violating that to the highest degree. It's taking things that they purchased and making more copies, and they did not purchase those copies. So this is why this is such a big deal. Also, Mr. Sampel, if it is a violation of copyright law, could be in legal trouble for not acting accordingly with the information that was presented to him. And the teachers might be in trouble as well as Mrs. Lynn, but it will mainly fall along the school district and school administration. The ethical issues: while Mrs. Lynn is trying to perform a nice act by saving the school money, it could end up costing the district a lot more in the long run. Also, Mr. Sampel could ethically be wrong if he does not stop this illegal copying of the programs. So the synthesizing sentence, the main idea in one sentence is: Mrs. Lynn has possibly illegally copied software programs that were supposed to be used specifically for the computer lab at St. Regis School, and Mr. Sampel has to determine whether this action should be promoted or dismissed. So let's learn about the people in this case study. First, we have Keith Sampel. Interesting last name, almost the same as mine. A man who has been the principal at St. Regis School for 3 years. He's well liked by the community and staff, and he has a strong emphasis on establishing positive relationships. Lastly, he does not approve of Mrs. Lynn violating copyright laws. He asks her to stop making copies. His race is unknown. Mrs. Lynn is a woman who is the library media specialist at St. Regis School. She helps with the organization of new computers, new technology, and I think she's a big help for Mr. Sampel in normal times. Mrs. Lynn cares about saving the school and district money while giving teachers new opportunities to better their students' learning. This is why she copied the software programs for individual classroom use. Then we have Mrs. Brandon. She's a third grade teacher at St. Regis. She is new, but has 3 years experience in another school in the northern part of the state. She does not support violating these copyright laws. Mrs. Williams is a woman who is a third grade teacher as well at St. Regis. She has taught there her entire teaching career. She's happy to receive the copies of the software, but is either not bothered or unaware by the copyright violations. And Mrs. Evans is a woman who is the PTA president for the St. Regis School. She approved the stretching of PTA dollars by copying the software. She might not be aware that that is violating copyright. So the place facts. There are many unknowns. We are aware that it is a rural district with 420 students in grades kindergarten through 8th grade. Also, it might be a low-income rural community based on the emphasis of saving money. Lastly, while the location is ultimately unknown, it's 25 miles away from the nearest city and is most likely not in the northern part of the state because Mrs. Brandon taught somewhere from the northern part of the state. So that's pretty much what we know about St. Regis. Now, the program facts. There are also a lot of unknown sections in this. That said, we do know St. Regis supports students K through 8. They go to high school in the nearby city for grades 9 through 12. They have 420 students who attend the school, 2 teachers per grade, so that is roughly 23 students per classroom. Lastly, St. Regis has a strong possibility of being a public school since the town's named St. Regis as well. So I kind of at first got the impression that it might be private, but since the town's name is that, I really do think it's public because they also receive public funding as well from the state. Very small amount, but still they receive it. So, review of information. If Mr. Sampel allows Mrs. Lynn to continue with copying programs, the school district could pay heavily for the violation of copyright laws. If the author or anybody figured out, that could be really bad. Mrs. Lynn and Mr. Sample's integrity could be at stake with the school amongst the staff, depending on the opinion of others pertaining to the situation. Whether they stop it or keep going, somebody will look at them in a different light. So their integrity is at stake. The community outlook in this situation could be negative towards Mr. Sample and the school. I know in small town communities, they might say, oh, well, they're just trying to, help the kids more. But at the end of the day, the school district has to act in a lawful manner. Lastly, there are many stakeholders in this situation who have not been consulted about the copyright violations. Mrs. Williams, the other teachers in the building who received copies, and Mrs. Evans were not aware that copyright laws were violated. Also, the software program author has not been notified. And there's really no more information that can be gathered from the resources in this case study, but there is enough to make a decision. So a few possible options and consequences. The first is to not make a decision at all, take no action. This could result in a possible lawsuit from the author of the software program due to copyright violations. The school district could end up paying lots of money, and Mrs. Lynn and Mr. Sample could lose their jobs. We could require Mrs. Lynn to stop making copies of the software program, destroying the copies that were already made, and this option would also include Mrs. Lynn keeping her job. She could have cost the district a lot of money, but she was trying to do a nice thing. I see where Mrs. Lynn is coming from, but that behavior shouldn't be tolerated, but her heart's in the right place. So this option is probably the safest. It could provoke school and community backlash, but the backlash will not be as bad since the principal is well liked. He's established that rapport with the community and the staff, and that goes a long way. Excuse me. Also, there's no change in personnel. And in her eyes, Mrs. Lynn's, she's just trying to do something nice for the school. Third option, relieve Mrs. Lynn of her duties and make sure the copies are destroyed. This option would definitely have some school and community backlash, for sure, because she's just trying to do the right thing and she's fired. That won't look good in a small town community that's close. Also, it could hurt the principal's relationship style reputation. And replacing a librarian in the middle of the school year sounds very difficult for a small town school. Next would be relieve Mrs. Lynn of her duties and do nothing of the copyright or the copies. And this could really be problematic since you are still facing a lawsuit and you're looking for a new librarian. And last, relieve Mrs. Brandon of her duties and do nothing about the copies. That still leaves the possibility of a lawsuit. Plus, you are also releasing someone of their duties who is just trying to do the right thing in another sense. So the evaluation of options. Number one, not making a decision at all. The community, PTA, and staff are happy that Mr. Sample and Mrs. Lynn are stretching their money. Teachers have access to the software programs in their classrooms. Mr. Sample's positive reputation grows even more. The cons, though, the school and district could face a possible lawsuit. That is very possible. Mrs. Brandon could be disheartened by that situation. You kind of want those newer teachers to the district to feel welcome and heard that could really hurt that. If the lawsuit happens, Mr. Sample and Mrs. Lynn could lose their jobs, the district could owe a lot of money, and this could lead to future copyright laws being ignored by the staff. Second, require Mrs. Lynn to stop making copies and also have her keep her job and fundraise for more copies in the future. This is great because everybody keeps their job. Lawsuit is avoided. Mr. Sample is seen as fair and lawful. That is very big. And that goes really well with his reputation. Teachers can still use the computer lab for access to the software programs. Individual teacher use in the classrooms is still possible in the future, and a positive rapport with Mrs. Brandon is built. She's heard, she's seen, even though she had a difficult situation with a colleague, she's still being heard and for doing the right thing. The cons of this, Mr. Sample could have community and school backlash. Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Evans could have a negative outlook on the situation, but that's something we'll address in the action steps. And teachers are not able to use the software programs in their classrooms immediately. Number 3, relieve Mrs. Lynn of her duties and make sure the copies are destroyed. The lawsuit is avoided. That's always a plus. Teachers can still use the computer lab, and Mrs. Lynn, who could have cost the district thousands of dollars, is not able to repeat that behavior anymore. The cons for this, though, she's no longer available to work as the media specialist, plus the computer lab teacher. That brings a whole new side of things. They need to hire a new librarian in the middle of the year. The community and school backlash are still possible because she's probably well liked by the community. She was talking about parents who work very hard for their kids, and teachers are not able to use software programs immediately. Number 4, relieve Mrs. Lynn of her duties and do nothing about the copies. This has all kinds of cons, but the one pro is teachers have access to the software programs in their classrooms. Mrs. Lynn is no longer available to work. You still have to replace her. Community backlash, school backlash. The lawsuit is still on the table. There's all kinds of potentials with that where people lose their jobs, cost the district money, and future copyright laws might be ignored. Relieving Mrs. Brandon of her duties and doing nothing about the copies. Teachers will have access, but you still have to find a 3rd grade teacher in the middle of the school year. You could still face backlash. The lawsuit is still looming, and all the consequences that go along with that. And it also could lead to a lawsuit with Mrs. Brandon because that is not very fair to her. So the selection of the best option. In my opinion, option number 2 should be the one utilized. With the positive and respectful culture Mr. Sample has built, this could lead to his advantage in having the tough conversations with staff and community members who might not agree with this decision right away. Ultimately, it's what's for the best, and school leaders have to make these decisions all the time. Everybody might not agree, but as long as they're doing what's best for the district and the students, that should be the option taken. Lastly, this decision would appease all stakeholders. The community and staff members want to save money, and avoiding a lawsuit is still meeting that need. Mr. Sample ultimately is doing the right and lawful action in this situation. So, the steps to implement this action